All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are previewing the ongoing training camp battles at the wide receiver position, talking about if Drake London can continue the legacy of players like Roddy White and Julio Jones as the Falcons' alpha wide receiver, as well as the other roster battles for key depth roles at this position.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong, however, on Twitter at falcfans. And, of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, as well as part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Blue Nile. Make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com, and Locked On Sports listeners get $50 off purchases of $500 or more. This podcast exclusive includes engagement. Just use the code Locked On at checkout. So, guys, I thank you once more for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, as well as on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. Give us a like, hit that bell when you do, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So today's audio and video version of Locked On Falcons is all about the training camp preview of the Falcons wide receivers, continuing where we picked off going position by position. We talked about quarterbacks. We talked about running backs already this week. Today, we're talking about the wide receivers. We're going to have the big question of the season, whether or not the Falcons have their number one in Drake London. The other question of the summer is going to be who's going to be the number two, who's going to be the number three, and then we'll get into the other roster battles later on today's episode. But we're hoping that Drake London continues the legacy from top number one wide receivers that the Falcons have had in Roddy White, Julio Jones. We were expecting Calvin Ridley to pick up that mantle. Of course, that did not go the way we thought it would. And the question is going to be, can Drake London live up to those same expectations? The Falcons have had a nice little run for basically 15 years of having that type of player on their roster. And I am optimistic that Drake London has the ability to do so, but that optimism is cautious optimism, right? And, you know, the thing to point out about his predecessors is none of those guys were great as rookies. We know Roddy wasn't great. Julio and Ridley were certainly productive as rookies, but really, if you go back and you look at their rookie seasons, you know, they had, you know, some big games, a handful of big games, and then were relatively quiet for the majority of their rookie seasons. And, you know, I'm kind of expecting the same out of Drake London in year one. Which means I think like he'll probably have a half dozen or so games where he's putting up number one wide receiver production. He's getting 5, 8 catches, 70, 80 or more yards, that typical number one wide receiver stat line that you see. And then there'll probably be just as many, if not more, games where he's struggling to get 2 or 3 catches. And that comes with the territory. There are going to be growing pains. And we know that wide receivers typically, although Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson are causing us to rethink this a little bit, and particularly the last 2 draft classes, that wide receivers typically don't hit the ground running coming out of the gates in the NFL. But we'll see if Drake London is the exception to that rule or continues that trend that we've seen in recent years. Now, my main concerns with Drake London are kind of twofold. The first one is that he shows one of the notable red flags that we've seen with early round receivers that don't quite make it in the NFL. The other one is less to do with Drake London, more to do with Arthur Smith. But on that first thing, you know, typically when you look at early round wide receivers that don't work out in the NFL, I don't want to use the B word and call them busts, but those guys are particularly first and second round picks. They typically, if they don't work out in the NFL, it boils down to one of 2 red flags that they show. The first one is route and running limitations. Corey Coleman's a great example of that. Kevin White is another example of that. I don't think that's going to be a problem for Drake London. What I do think is a legit concern, how big a concern time will tell, is the other issue, which is lack of separation. Guys that just can't separate from coverage. N'Keal Harry is probably the poster child of that currently in the NFL. And I do think that is a concern with Drake London. We'll see how much of a concern it will be as time wears on. I think he has the route running prowess that he can mitigate that concern as time grows on. But I do wonder if that will be a concern, at least in year one. The other issue is related to Arthur Smith's play calling, because, I have the spicy, controversial take that I don't think Arthur Smith play calling really does a great job of maximizing the talent that he has. And I wonder about that with Drake London, because that's part of the reason why you hear me asking every guest that we've had since the draft, is Drake London outside or inside receiver? Because my concern is, we'll see how big a concern this is that the Falcons want Drake London to be this, AJ Brown, Julio Jones outside weapon, and he may be better suited to be an inside guy. That if he's going to reach his potential to match the Roddys and the Julios and the Ridleys that at their peaks were one of the 10 to 15 best wide receivers in the league, all three of those guys, if London's going to be that guy, I don't think it's going to be as a true X in the mold of an AJ Brown or Julio Jones. I think it's going to be more of that slot guy in the mold of a Michael Thomas or an Anquan Bolden, whatever the big slot that you prefer to use as your comp. That's kind of what I see Drake London's max potential being in that role. And I wonder, will he be kind of square pegged as an X receiver? I don't think he'll be bad in that role. I think he'll be capable in that role, but I don't know if he's going to be one of the 10 or 15 best receivers in that role. And those are my two main issues with Drake London. And, continuing that point on the play calling point, I know this is not what today's episode is really about, but part of my optimism for the play calling with Arthur Smith, and despite my concerns, is similar to the same concerns we had in year one of Shanahan or Sark or Cutter. We saw big improvement for all three of those guys in year two, and I expect the same out of Arthur Smith. My cautious optimism comes from, I don't know how much improvement we're going to see this year, right? Like, I look at last year's roster, and I know, again, this is another controversial take, but I saw a talent level on this roster that, at least from a passing standpoint, had no business not being close to the middle of the pack last year, right? To me, when we look at their DVOA, passing DVOA, to me, this offense had more than enough talent to be in the 16 to 20 range, right? But they finished 26. And that, to me, is chalked purely up for underachieving. And I think that's has less to do with the talent and mostly due to the play calling, right? And so I don't look at this year's offense as significantly more talented than last year's offense. It's maybe marginally better overall, but not enough where if they do live up to those expectations, again, I go into this season expecting somewhere to be in that 16 to 20 range, with teams like the Raiders and the Browns and the Saints were last year from a passing standpoint. I don't think it's going to be because there's this massive influx of talent. I think it's going to be hinged on Arthur Smith's play calling being significantly better. And I think how big that jump the Falcons offense makes will hinge heavily on the wide receiver play, and particularly how explosive this wide receiver group is. We saw last year Gage and Ridley, who were the de facto number ones for the Falcons, combined for just 11 20-plus yard plays last year. Calvin Ridley had 11 alone in his rookie season. Julio, by the way, had 16. And I'm expecting the floor for Drake London to be somewhere in that range, floor of 12, maybe a ceiling of 18 to 20 explosive plays. I think he's capable of doing that if the play calling is there. And that to me is a legitimate concern, because to me, the biggest question I had of Arthur Smith when we hired him, based off of his first year in Atlanta and then going back and watching more of his offense in Tennessee, is this remains my number one concern with Arthur Smith, is how much of his offense and his playmaking ability and the offense it shows is him scheming up plays, or how much of it, to quote the great Steve Adazio, is just guys being dudes. Julio being a dude, Cordero Patterson being a dude, Kyle Pitts, AJ Brown, Derrick Henry being dudes. And so the question I wonder if we're going to have answered, if that continues to be the case moving forward for now year 4 of Arthur Smith calling plays in the NFL, do we find out 6 months from now, is Drake London also a dude? So that to me is the big question of the season. Is Drake London a dude or not, is kind of where I'm at. And we'll continue today's episode talking about what's the big question of the summer, and that's going to be, who are the other quote-unquote dudes that will be joining Drake London as the Falcons' top 3 receivers. And we have a lot of competition for those spots heading into the summer, and we'll get into which of the guys I think are the better bets for landing some of those spots. But before we get there, guys, I do want to remind you that most of you guys are checking this show out on Thursday, and of course tonight is the NBA draft. And the Locked On Network has you covered for the live coverage, but it's not just one big live show. All the NBA Locked On shows are going live on YouTube tonight. So check out your favorite. If you're an Atlanta Hawks fan, you can check out Locked On Hawks on YouTube, subscribe to it, hit that bell so that you know when they go live to get all the great coverage on tonight's NBA draft. And guys, I want to tell you about Rock Auto. With ever increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why wait while the person behind the counter orders parts on their computer when you already have access to rockauto.com at home or in your pocket? Save time and money when using Rock Auto instead of spending up to twice as much for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years, and they have reliably low prices for every customer. They have everything you need from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Just go to rockauto.com, browse their easy-to-use website, and find all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so that they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So, guys, once again, thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And always make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on your preferred podcast platform, including on YouTube. And, today's your, first listen, we're talking about, the number 2 and number 3 wide receivers after we just spent talking about the number 1 guys, right? And this is important. This is where we're going to get a little nerdy with the roster stuff, right? But, for the 5 of you out there that are really into projecting 53-man rosters, this is where you're going to have some fun. For the rest of you, I don't know. Talk amongst yourselves. But, the Falcons typically keep 5 active game day receivers, right? And only really 3 of those guys play on offense, right? That's due to the fact that the Falcons were 31st last year in usage of 11 personnel, which refers to your standard 3 wide receiver set. And for those of you that don't know what those numbers mean, the first number means the number of running backs. The second number means the number of tight ends. So 11 personnel is 1 running back, 1 tight end, therefore 3 wide receivers because you have 5, targets on a given play. But when you factor all the personnel packages that have 3 or more wide receivers, so like 10 personnel, which is a 4 wide receiver set, the Falcons were actually dead last in usage last year. And so essentially that tells you that they only really need, unless there's an injury, they only really need 3 receivers to operate their offense. And we know one of those receivers is going to be Drake London. We suspect, I think most of us think Bryan Edwards is going to be one of the other ones. Whether he's technically the 2 or the 3, I guess, is up for grabs, but most of us assume he'll be one of the other 2. And that kind of means that there's only competition for one of those spots. And I think that competition is primarily going to be between Damiere Byrd and Olamide Zaccheaus. Right? I think Zacchaeus enters the summer as the incumbent. He's the Z wide receiver. We expect Drake London to be the starting X. And then when the Falcons go to their 3 wide receiver sets, I imagine we'll see Drake London move to the slot, and Bryan Edwards will step on the field as the team's go-to X wide receiver. And so that Z wide receiver spot is going to be critical, and Zacchaeus has played that role for a number of years now. And I think Damiere Byrd was brought in to compete for him. And I think Damiere Byrd has a unique opportunity ahead of him because this is a young group of wide receivers. There's only 4 guys on the roster currently that are over the age of 25 at this position. It's Damiere Byrd, it's Kadero Hodge, it's Cam Batson, and Geronimo Allison. And I think the Falcons would love to have a veteran player for these guys to look up to. And I think Byrd kind of fits the bill for them. And I think it's notable that the Falcons are thinking along this way because he's the only receiver other than Drake London that has any guaranteed money on this contract, right? And while it's not a ton of guaranteed money, it is, $400,000 is not a huge sum, but it's considerable when you sign like 3 other guys and they all have 0 guaranteed dollars on their contract. So I think that tells you that the Falcons envision a role for Damiere Byrd, and I think he is perfectly suited for that veteran sort of leader in this wide receiver room. And whether that leads to him overtaking Zacchaeus as the team's primary Z wide receiver and being that number 2 or number 3 wide receiver, or he settles in for that 4th spot, remains to be seen, but we'll see how competition plays out. Now, that 4th spot is going to be interesting because that is primarily a special teams role. Christian Blake, after all the injuries, was primarily that guy. And for most of the season, outside of like a handful of games where he got some garbage time reps and 1 or 2 games where he was promoted to the 3rd wide receiver due to injuries to like Tajay Sharp or whatever, he basically averaged like 5 snaps a game. And so that 4th wide receiver is not really, going back to the point where the Falcons barely use 3 wide receivers relative to most teams, that 4th wide receiver is primarily a special teams role. And that's why I kind of see Olamide Zaccheaus fitting into that role, because people forget that Olamide Zaccheaus opened the season as the team's gunner, has been a regular as on the punt team as a gunner for like the last 3 years. But we'll see if, Byrd also has experience playing special teams. But I think this is kind of perfect for Olamide Zaccheaus. That guy, if he's going to play on Sundays, is not going to get a ton of reps on offense unless there's an injury, but could get a considerable amount of reps on special teams. And I think Zacchaeus is sort of tailor-made for that. And that puts guys like Auden Tate and Geronimo Allison and Cameron Bass and some of these other veterans on the roster. I think they're firmly on the roster bubble because they lack the sort of special teams value. Batson has some return experience, but has barely played in coverage. And that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about coverage ability because we know, and we'll get to this later, the return battle is not open for grabs due to the presence of Avery Williams on this team. And while I'm a big fan of Auden Tate, I feel like once the team acquired Bryan Edwards, it kind of made his role really redundant, right? Like you could argue that basically, okay, they drafted Drake London. Okay, Auden Tate will be the backup X and maybe be in the mix to be the third wide receiver or whatever the case may be. But then they bring in Bryan Edwards, who's also an X wide receiver. And it's like, okay, you don't need this many X's, right? Especially when you also have Kyle Pitts, who basically performed as the Falcons X wide receiver last year. So you essentially have 4 X's. You don't need 4 X's, right? Especially when 2 of them, or really all 4 of them, don't play special teams, right? Now, if, Tate played special teams or has experience playing special teams, it would be a different story, but he doesn't really have that experience. And so, I spent years complaining about the lack of depth at the wide receiver position, in particular at that X wide receiver, not having a capable backup in the event that when Julio Jones would go down. And you saw it derail the Falcons offense outside of the 1 year where they had Alger Robinson and the year where they had Marvin Hall in those roles. But now it feels like the Falcons have gone completely in the other opposite and going overkill. You don't need 4 wide receivers. And so that's why guys like Tate, as well as Allison, to me, are on the roster bubble, because they don't have that special teams experience and bring that value. And I think they're going to be hard pressed to overtake guys like Olamide Zaccheaus and Damiere Byrd, who do have a little bit more special teams experience and also aren't sort of redundant in basically 4th string X's or whatever the case may be. But we'll see how it plays out. Obviously, there's competition. Nothing is set in stone. So any one of these guys could surprise and prove and play at a high enough level where they do basically force the Falcons to keep them, even if they is overkill in some of the depths. Now, speaking of Bryan Edwards and the guy that's likely taking Auden Tate's job, I'm hopeful for what Bryan Edwards can bring to the table this year. Right, he's a Mohamed Sanu type of player, and longtime listeners know that that's not necessarily my type of receiver. Again, another guy that's not necessarily explosive and may struggle to separate a little bit, but is a physical type of player. But that player, as we saw with Mohamed Sanu, has value, can be a valuable role player, particularly if he's bringing plus value on moving the chains on 3rd downs, being effective in the red zone, as well as being an effective run blocker, all the things that Mohamed Sanu did well. And my hope with Bryan Edwards is that he can be a guy that can also give you some explosive plays. That was something that he did quite well for the Raiders the last couple of years, primarily showing up in like the 4th quarter and overtimes of games. Hopefully he can be a little bit more consistent than that. Hopefully he can be a little bit more consistent than Mohamed Sanu, but Mohamed Sanu was the type of player that, for most of the season, he would get you like 2 or 3 catches, be a solid number 3 wide receiver. And when you had Julio and Gabriel and Ridley and those guys cooking, or even in the Cincinnati days when it was AJ Green and Marvin Jones, like he was perfectly fine in that. And then every now and then, handful of games, you get a really big performance from Mohamed Sanu. And I'm kind of expecting the same from Bryan Edwards this year. We'll see if we get more than that from Bryan Edwards this year, if he exceeds my expectations, if he can be that number 3 guy, if Pitts, if London are the top 2 guys. And so I think that gives you a really solid trio of wide receivers and makes it so that your wide receiver core is not a major question mark moving forward, because you have the pieces there moving forward. So we'll see if Bryan Edwards will step up, or is it Zacchaeus? Is it Byrd? Is it Auden Tate? Is it Geronimo Allison, or any of these other guys? But we'll talk about some of the other guys as we wrap up today's training camp preview of the wide receiver position, talking about that last spot on a depth chart, which is probably where special teams really matters. That's where we'll talk about Frank Darby, Kadero Hodge, and some of these undrafted free agents making a name in terms of special teams as we continue today's episode. But before we get there, I do want to tell you guys about the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, which Locked On Falcons is part of, Locked On Hawks is part of. There are, of course, 3 different shows covering local sports as well as national sports. As A to Z with Mark Zinno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanisha Batiste. release, all on the same Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast feed. You know they'll be covering you, got you covered for the Braves as well as the Hawks draft night, as well as Locked On Hawks there. So check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on your preferred podcast platform. And if you check them out on YouTube, you'll also be able to check out the Locked On Braves postcast, breaking down every Atlanta Braves win and loss. And guys, I want to tell you about the folks at Built Bar who produce the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. And in fact, it's even better than a candy bar because Built Bars not only taste good, they're good for you. They're low in sugar, calories, and carbs, high in protein, high in fiber. All Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, and you can find them in a variety of flavors. And all summer long, they're unveiling new part-time flavors. So go check out what the latest flavors are at Built.com. You can get caramel brownie, brownie batter puff, cookies and cream churro puff, double chocolate, coconut almond, cherry barcia, mint brownie, peanut butter brownie, salted caramel, raspberry, and so much more. Find your favorite or order yourself a mixed box to try them all. All you got to do is go to Built.com. And when you do, use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your order. That's code LOCKED15, LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. So this is where, I get to flex my muscles and get into my special teams matters brand here on the podcast. When we talk about the sort of last spot, we already talked about kind of how multiple veteran guys like Allison and Byrd and Edwards and London, Tate and Zacchaeus are all sort of competing for a handful of spots. But there's still options, that fifth spot on game day, if those guys are all sort of competing for the top four spots. And again, I understand when people sit here and think, oh, those six guys I just named, Allison, Byrd, Edwards, London, Tate, and Zacchaeus, are the most proven wide receivers and offensive threats on this team. So if we're projecting six wide receivers to make the team, those are going to be the six guys to make it. Well, not so fast, my friend. This is where special teams matters, right? And it's really going to, those last couple of spots, that fifth, that sixth spot of the wide receiver group is not really probably going to go to the guy who's the best offensive threat. It's going to be for the guy that contributes the most on special teams. This is where Frank Darby comes into the mix. This is where Cardero Hodge comes into the mix. This is how Frank Darby saw the field last year. He was okay as a gunner on the punt team, and there's room for improvement there. And I think this is part of the reason why the Falcons brought in Cardero Hodge, who's specialized as a gunner over the years, was especially good for the Browns in 2019, was one of, a dozen or more guys in the NFL that had double-digit special teams tackles. Most of those came on kickoff coverage, but it's understandable when you're a gunner on punt team because we know that the gunners are typically the first guys down the field, and we know that punt returners are trained to basically make the first guy miss, which is often the gunner, before they get upfield. So gunners don't typically rack up a ton of tackles on special teams, but they can certainly be very advantageous and disruptive and force those fair catches and down those punts and all those various things. That's their value. So we'll see if Darby can improve upon last year. Obviously, having that draft pedigree probably means, all things being equal, the Falcons will give the job to Frank Darby over Cardero Hodge. But because Hodge has a little bit more of a proven background to be a high-level gunner, I do think he does have the edge going into camp to win that fifth wide receiver spot on the roster. And maybe that leads to someone like a Frank Darby being pushed down the depth chart and potentially towards the practice squad. And I think, the other thing that's going to be valuable for a lot of these guys at the wide receiver position is the return abilities. We talked earlier about, how, there's no real competition for Avery Williams, but you will probably not see a lot of Avery Williams this summer returning punts in preseason games and in practice, because we already know what Avery Williams can bring to the table there. And so that's not really up for debate or discussion or competition. What you really need to find out is, do you have an emergency option in the event that Avery Williams goes down, tweaks an ankle in a game? Who do you have another option for yourself, right? You don't want to be in a situation like we were years ago, a decade ago, whenever our punt returner got injured, whether it was Alan Rossum or Eric Weems, I can't remember which guy it was, but they would put Brian Finneran back there and all he would do was fair catch. You want to see if you have a legit dude that can actually be a threat as a returner. And so I would sit here and say, because Damiere Byrd and Olamide Zaccheaus have a little bit of experience returning punts and kicks, that if the season were to start tomorrow, they would probably be the guy. But that gives an opportunity for guys like Cameron Batson and Jared Bernhardt and Stanley Berryhill and any of these other young guys on the roster to improve their stocks and increase their chances of making the roster and or the practice squad if they can show some valuable return skills over the course of this summer. So to me, when I look at these undrafted free agents, especially, Jared Bernhardt's the most intriguing of the guys just because he has a very interesting background as sort of an all-star, all-American lacrosse player at Maryland, then transferring to Ferris State and becoming a very productive option quarterback for them. It's sort of similar background to some former Patriot prominent receivers like Chris Hogan, who was a former lacrosse player, Julian Edelman, was former college convert to the position. And so you're sort of intrigued by the potential, like, oh, the Patriots could develop that guy. Couldn't the Falcons possibly do that? And we'll sort of see if TJ Yates has some of the juice to get that development. Again, you're not necessarily expecting that year one, but theoretically, you're sitting here being like, okay, like it's intriguing if we can develop Bernhardt just like Hogan or Edelman 3 years from now. Could he be like our number 3 wide receiver? Maybe. We'll see. So he's intriguing of this group, and we'll see if anybody else stands out. So in conclusion, to wrap up today's episode and give you at least a small morsel of positivity to close out today's episode. I think the Falcons are definitely in a better place this year at the wide receiver position entering training camp than they were a year ago. Last year, we were sitting here scratching our head like, are we going to get an X wide receiver to replace Julio Jones? Now you can maybe argue the Falcons have flipped it and like they're all good at X. They have an overabundance of X wide receivers, and maybe they have a couple of question marks at that Z position. But we'll see how that bears out for them. I still think they probably could use some more speed at the position, but I'm willing to punt that to next offseason before the Falcons regularly address it. So I think right now they have a solid core. We'll see what London, we'll see what Edwards can do. We'll see if anybody else emerges as a viable candidate. Is this the breakout year that Olamide Zaccheaus, that we've been tantalized by the potential of Zacchaeus these last couple of years? Does he finally have that breakout season this year, or is he relegated to continue to be a role player or whatever the case may be? So time will tell on that. We'll find out. We'll have our answers 6 months from now. We'll see what answers we have 3 months from now. But that will do it for us, guys, on our training camp preview. We have, of course, more to come. We'll get to the tight end position next week, but tomorrow's episode, we'll be talking about Justin Schaefer. We'll be doing our scouting report of the Falcons' 6th-round offensive lineman to wrap up the week on tomorrow's episode, talking about whether or not the coaching is going to be able to elevate him, similar to what we talked about today with Drake London, as well as what we talked about previously with Desmond Ridder and Tyler Algier. It's the same conversation with all these rookie players. Can they be developed, or whatever the case may be? And we'll talk about that with Justin Schaefer. And tomorrow, I'm sure you guys will be checking out Locked On Hawks to get your post-NBA draft recaps, Locked On NBA as well, Locked On Sports Atlanta. Head on over to Rock Auto, head on over to Built Bar, and make sure, if you want to stay up on the latest NFL news, of course, make sure you subscribe to Locked On NFL on your preferred podcast platform. It's all on the same podcast apps that you find Locked On Falcons, whether that be Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, or on YouTube, guys. So I appreciate you for tuning in for another episode. What are your thoughts on the Falcons wide receiver position? Tell me why I'm crazy for criticizing Arthur Smith's play calling. Tell me why I'm crazy for questioning Drake London or Bryan Edwards or Auden Tate by leaving a comment here on Locked On Falcons on YouTube, sending me an email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or hit me up on social media, either Facebook or Twitter at Locked On Falcons. So guys, that will do it for us here. Appreciate it. Till then.